I look at the episodes that have performed really well, and then I think about if there are ways I can talk about the same concept with a fresh take or a new story or give a different way of explaining it. Now, you guys aren't going back and listening to all 720 episodes. So something that performed really well 2 years ago is probably not on your radar. Or even if you listened to it 2 years ago, you've probably forgotten about the concept I was explaining. So I go back, I look at those kinds of episodes that have performed really well, and then I share a different take on it, or I update it if I've learned something new, or I explain it in a different way. Hey, welcome back to Imperfect Action. This is episode 720. Today, I'm answering a very common question that I get, which is how on earth do you still keep coming up with things to talk about 720 episodes later? And when I first started this show, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to even talk about after 100 episodes, let alone 720 of them. And look, to be honest, I do sometimes run out of ideas. So this episode, I'm going to share some of the things that I will do to get more episode ideas when the inspiration well runs a little bit dry. I usually come back to one of the methods that I'm going to share in this episode. Now, if you're not already subscribed to the show, hit the subscribe button, and it just means you'll get each new episode straight to your podcast app of choice every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. All right, the first thing that I do to keep coming up with ideas, number one, I ask my audience, what are your goals and what are the obstacles standing in the way of you reaching these goals? Now, every year I send out a mid-year and an end-of-year survey asking my audience questions like this. And when they tell me the obstacles that are standing in the way of their goals, I turn those into content ideas. For example, here's one that was from the survey that I sent out back in July. So somebody said, my goal is to create and launch my first online course. And the obstacle that they said was fear and loads of work. Now, the content ideas that I get from that might be why you don't need to create your course before you launch it. Or maybe something like, oh, are you afraid to launch your course? Here's what you need to know. Or how launching your course before creating it can ease the fear of launching. And this is way more useful content than just assuming I know what my audience wants or what they are struggling with. Number two, I ask my audience, what 3 questions do you have about topic, whatever the topic is? And I also include this one in that survey. And the questions that they ask me then give me a ton of ideas for potential episode content, right? So I can create episodes that answer the questions. For example, this episode is answering a question that I get asked all the time, which is how do I come up with so many content ideas? Great, easy. That's another episode idea. And, another one that comes up a lot, or one that came up actually in the mid-year survey, was what are the key things to focus on in the very beginning when money is low and you don't have help? And I answered that in episode 651, which if you want the direct link, you can DM me on Instagram 651 and I'll send you the link to that episode. But that episode was, if I had $5,000 to start my business, this is where I would spend it for maximum results. Number 3, team content brainstorming calls. So this is one that we started doing this year as a team. So once every 2 months or so, I will jump on Zoom with Lauren and Jay, who are on my team, and we each have to bring 10 potential podcast episode ideas to the call. And from those 10 ideas each, we usually end up with way more than 30 topics because one person will say an idea, and then from that idea, we'll be like, oh, and then we could also do that. We could also try that. So we kind of bounce off each other, and it ends up being a ton of new ideas in just one call. Now, this has been super helpful for me because, when it's just you brainstorming by yourself, you don't always know what you don't know. You don't always see what you are missing. And especially now in my business where I'm not in the Facebook groups and the Telegram pods as much as Lauren and Jay are, so they can tell me what kind of questions people are asking, where they're struggling. And that means that I can keep creating content that is relevant to my audience, but also relevant to my paying students. Okay, number 4, I ask my listeners to write in with a dilemma or a question that they want advice on. And I haven't done one of these episodes in a while because I just haven't had that many questions submitted. So if you want to submit a question for an Ask Steph episode, head to stephtaylor.co/asksteph. We'll pop a link to that in the show notes as well. And I love these episodes. I get to go a lot deeper into a specific problem or a specific situation. And while I usually pick the ones that are going to help as many people as possible, I still answer it in the way that that person has asked it, if that makes sense. So I'm still answering it from that person's specific situation rather than a general broad answer. And the questions that get asked or questions get submitted also then spark ideas for other episodes. Number 5, I paste my audience survey responses into Chat-GPT. I give it some examples of previous episodes that have performed really well, and then I ask it to give me some more topic suggestions based on the ones that have worked well and the questions and the problems that my listeners are struggling with. Now, some of the ideas it has come up with have been absolute duds. For example, one of them was blending work and passion, your ultimate marketing plan. I'm not really sure about that one. But there have been some good ones that have been decent, that have come out of there, or that have sparked ideas for other episodes that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And the key here is that I am pasting in that audience survey, and I am pasting in some episode titles that have worked really well. Because otherwise, if I just asked it like, hey, this is an online business strategy podcast, can you give me some topic ideas? It would just be like really broad stuff, like how to define your ideal client. Great. That's not very exciting at all. Like, as with anything ChatGPT, what you put in is going to determine the quality of the outputs. And if you give it more information, you give it more specific prompts, then the outputs you get are going to be much more specific. Now, if you want a little bit more on AI and using ChatGPT correctly, I recently did an interview on this show with my good friend Ronsley Vaz. You can find that at episode 710. He talked a bit about how to prompt ChatGPT to get the best kind of results. So if you want a direct link to that episode, DM me on Instagram at stephtaylor.co, send me 710-710, and I'll send you a direct link to that episode with Ronsley. Okay, number 6, I look at the episodes that have performed really well, and then I think about if there are ways I can talk about the same concept with a fresh take or a new story or give a different way of explaining it. Now, you guys aren't going back and listening to all 720 episodes. So something that performed really well 2 years ago is probably not on your radar. Or even if you listened to it 2 years ago, you've probably forgotten about the concept I was explaining. So I go back, I look at those kinds of episodes that have performed really well, and then I share a different take on it, or I update it if I've learned something new, or I explain it in a different way. I use new stories, new analogies, everything is content, right? Every time something happens in my life, I'm like, oh, that could be an analogy for something in business. Like, I recently got stuck in Vanuatu, which is a little island in the Pacific that has one major airline, and their one major airline has one international jet. They have one jet that services Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Auckland. And that one jet broke down. And I was stuck on the island because of that. And the content that came out of that, or the story that came out of that, is like, this is what it's like to be relying on one income stream in your business. It's like relying on just one plane to service all of these major cities that are bringing you all of your tourists. Okay, and then number 7, I look at previous episodes and I zoom in or zoom out on each of these topics. So for each topic, we can either go deeper or we can go broader. We can zoom in or we can zoom out. So for example, if I'm sharing an episode about how I come up with content ideas, i.e., today's episode, I might zoom in and then share an episode on how I survey my audience to get more content ideas. Or I could zoom out and share an episode on what I think makes a good content topic. I could zoom in and create an episode on how I zoom in on content topics. And I could zoom out and I could talk about how I repurpose my old content topics to come up with more ideas. So there you have it, 7 ways to come up with more content ideas. After 720 episodes, I haven't run out of ideas just yet. Now, if you haven't already left a quick rating and review, please take 30 seconds to do so. I read every single one of them. It means a lot to me because a lot of work goes into creating this show. Thanks so much for listening. Catch you next time.